Hello again, everybody. This is James Bartley, and you're watching the Cosmic Switchboard Show. Today, our very special guests are Jerry Marzinsky and Sherry Swiney. Jerry Marzinsky has been in the psychiatric rehab field as a counselor for many years. He was a team leader for a 32-bed female unit with clients consisting of alcoholics, substance abusers, psychiatric, and probationary populations, responsible for coordinating inpatient rehabilitation services for the southern 23 counties in the state of Georgia. He managed over $10,000 in caseload funding yearly. Case management and documentation, crisis intervention, group, family, vocational, and individual counseling, provision of feedback to psychiatric and medical staff, program development of alcohol and substance abuse programs, treatment planning, evaluation of suicide potential, intake planning and follow-up, development of and administration of a substance abuse education training program for teachers, supervised and coordinated activities and training for a 6-county vocational training center for mentally retarded or psychiatrically impaired clients. And we will have all of Jerry's bio information, his very impressive CV on our dedicated website, as well as on Sherry and Jerry's website. Sherry Swiney is a construction engineer, retired. She worked on major construction projects across the United States and abroad for over 30 years. She now resides in Kentucky, where she is building her home and doing organic gardening. Sherry is an advocate for growing your own food, staying away from big pharmaceutical medicine for good health, avoiding GMOs and conventionally grown foods laden with pesticides, and unplugging from today's political system to be as self-sufficient as possible. In 1996, Sherry founded the international human rights organization called the Patrick Crusade, which stands for People Aligned to Replace Injustice and Cruelty with Knowledge. And she also has quite an extensive background, and she has gone through this challenge of hearing voices. But as we'll go on in this interview, Sherry has managed to, without medication, get rid of these voices. And these voices are more than just voices. They are quite malign entities, actually. In actual fact, the website is keyholejourney.com. So without any further ado, Jerry Marzinsky, Sherry Swiney, welcome to the Cosmic Switchboard Show.
Hi, thank you for having us on.
Yeah, and I wanted to introduce Sherry. I think this is the first time she's done one of these interviews, and it takes a lot of courage to do this. A lot of people wouldn't. So, you know, I was working with Sherry for more than a decade while I was working psych in the state prison. And one day we were talking, and I was telling her about an inmate I had who was he was psychotic, but he was very interesting in hearing voices. So I started telling her about this, and, you know, out of the blue. Now, this is after knowing her for 10 years. She said, "Oh, yeah, I know that stuff. I know all about that." I'm like, where'd that come from? She said, "Well, I heard those things when I was a young woman." And I went, "What?" You know, as far as I was concerned, she's one of the most spiritually advanced people I ever saw. I mean, she's, you know, she's got a better memory than I do. That's for darn sure. and she's into engineering, and I hate math. So, you know, I said, "Well, okay, here, answer these questions." You know, so I'd hit her with a battery of questions that nobody could answer unless they actually heard these things. And bam, 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 right down the line, she had it right all the way down. I mean, there was no doubt in my mind that she had heard those things. But in working with her for 10 years, you would have never known it. That would, you know, she's one of the sanest people I've ever seen. She worked on multi-million-dollar engineering projects and supervised all that kind of stuff. She headed up this international human rights organization, and we worked on her crusade together. While I was working in our prison system that I couldn't lash out at, she was hitting up the Alabama system, so we both ganged up on the Alabama system. So I'd kind of tell her, "Hey, this is how these people think. You know, don't go here, don't go there, do this." Use phrases like deliberate indifference, you know, the kind of stuff that they really sweat blood over. So together we teamed up on the Alabama system. So she's been helping me on and off for years. She's editing a book that I've been working on. She finds stuff in the library and on the internet that I couldn't find and the library couldn't even find. her organizational skills put mine to shame. I mean, if it wasn't for her keeping me organized, I'd be a mess. So, what you're going to get is a view from me after 35 years of looking in at the voices from the outside and trying to figure how they worked and what they did and what they were, from the outside, and Sherry from the inside coming, okay, this is what I've experienced. So she's going to be talking to you at certain points in here, and we both agree on what she's saying. I mean, I've experienced everything she's going to tell you. So she surprised me, and especially when she came out and I said, well, how'd you get rid of them? And she said, well, I developed a program based on my computer knowledge to get rid of them. And I'm like, oh, because I'd only recently learned how to get rid of them, and I didn't know anything about computers. So I started grilling her about that. She told me how she cured herself from firsthand experience she had. So that was quite a surprise. She had a lot of valuable information, and I would run stuff by her all the time. When I ran into a strange case, I'd text her and say, hey, listen, what do you think about this? And, she'd give me the inside skivvy on the stuff. So, when I got to Central State Hospital, I didn't know anything about voices or hallucinations or schizophrenia. After 4 years of undergraduate psych at Temple University and 2 years in a master's degree, they didn't say anything about these things being voices. They just said they were hallucinations, and it's like, well, I didn't, I just assumed they were some kind of hallucination. And they would say, well, these people are out of touch with reality. There was no mention that this was voices that they were hearing, or what the voices said, or what they were like. And as undergraduate students in psych, we didn't have access to clinical populations. So you had to believe everything they said. You had no choice. And then you had to regurgitate it back. Problem is, I never trusted authority. That's the way I was raised. And, I'd like, how do they know that? I mean, how can I check this out? And we had no way to check it out. You just had to, okay, this is what it is. And, so I couldn't see what they were talking about, and I was always skeptical. And they're programming thousands of psych and psychiatric students in the same way. Psych students generally, for the most part, don't have access to clinical populations to see for themselves what's going on. And psychiatry, they're told what's going on. And while I was in the PhD program, my heavens, if you question those people, you were in trouble. You don't question them. You listen to them. And after working 7 years in the state hospital, some of the stuff they were telling me didn't mesh, and I would ask them questions, and that didn't go over very well. So, what psychiatry is being taught is that these hallucinations are due to a chemical imbalance in the patient's brain. And they come out of the medical schools thinking that. My wake-up call was when I got to Central State, and I started seeing all these contradictions to that, one after another, and they didn't mesh up. So that's where I got my wake-up call. So what I'd like to do is kind of give you guys a little overview of what that place was like. Because it's incomprehensible to the common man. It's an environment that belongs in science fiction. So Central State was in Milledgeville, Georgia, and it was at one point the largest psychiatric hospital in the world, with 13,000 patients. Now I got there in 1975. The hospital started accepting patients in 1842, before the American Civil War. And the first 13 patients that arrived in a wagon, chained, 175 years before I got there. So during the Civil War, the Union troops burned down almost all of Villageville, but they left the state hospital standing. with the stipulation that they also treat black people. That didn't go over real well with the Southerners at the time. At its greatest point, it expanded to 200 buildings and over 2,000 acres. In 1950s, the staff ratio was 1 doctor per 100 patients. And there were a lot of unexpected deaths that were kind of mysteriously swept under the table. The patient graveyard is estimated to contain between 20 and 30,000 bodies. The Atlanta Constitution referred to the place as a snake pit. Now, back in the old days, they didn't have psychiatric drugs, and the place was very dangerous. Back in the 1950s, the only way they had to control the population was with shock treatments. This is where they would put electrodes on each side of the patient's head and zap them with electricity. And I watched one of those, and I almost fainted when I went to walk out of there. It was like I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I had to grab a post and just kind of steady myself because, I'm not queasy, but after watching that, it was like, oh my heavens! And they were doing 3,000 shock treatments a year in the 1950s. Now, that settled down the patient population considerably because their brains were fried and they were kind of numbed. And one of the specialists in brain stuff said that each one of those shock treatments did irreparable damage to them. Now, that's what they used to control the population before any psychotic drugs got there. Antipsychotic drugs arrived only 10 years before I got there. And boy, there were stories flying around from some of the old-timey psychiatrists or attendants about what it was like back then. So what I did is went to the only history written on this thing, on this hospital. It's called But for the Grace of God, the Inside Story of the World's Largest Insane Asylum. And I copied down one of the accounts of one of the first 13 patients brought there before any psychotic drugs, and this happened around 1854. And this was patient 15, and he was described as a 23-year-old farmer, deranged for 6 months, hostile, violent, hallucinating visually, raved, ranted, and cursed, was chained in his room in the basement, and by the next morning had many bricks loose, and with his toes had worked out from the base of the wall rocks of the underpinning that would weigh 70 to 80 pounds. And they said it had his chain not been tightened the night before, he would have had enough room to undermine the building. So they placed him in another room, chained him to the floor, put him in a straitjacket, and did what they called was the puking treatment several times a day. Now, I wasn't sure what that was, and I looked it up, and what they did was they would give them an emetic that would make them sick and throw up. And you know how you feel after you throw up. You just don't feel like doing anything. Well, they called that the puking treatment. They'd fill him with an emetic. And they said after puking him several times a day, we succeeded in tranquilizing him and weakening his frenzy. 2 to 3 days of nauseance. They did this for 2 to 3 days. And cold baths and cathartics, and I'm not quite sure what that is, and digitalis and anodyne, and I don't know what that is. And they informed us. This was really fascinating. After this, the patient informed us the next morning after all this that he had gotten religion, and the night before that he quit sweating, was more pleasant. They said they relaxed their guard over this guy, and he took off and escaped. Now, when they followed up with him, he was functioning in society just great, which was amazing for a guy that was about ready to rip the foundation out of one of their buildings. Now, there's another one I thought you would find interesting. Now, this is similar to one, a patient that I actually saw who had done this. He was another violent homicidal patient who poked out his eye after the voices told him to. And he was brought to the hospital chained to one spot in leg irons with handcuffs after he spent 9 years chained in the community. He was so violent that he had to be chained to an ox cart under guard and was brought 175 miles to the hospital. Now, back in the early days, assaults on staff were common. Staff were bitten, they were beat, they were spat upon. I remember reading one account of a young nurse who is psychiatric patient. She was walking in front of the Powell Building back in the 1800s. A psychotic patient grabbed an axe, walked up behind her, cut her head off virtually, and then went back to work as if nothing happened.
Ugh.
So.
Jerry, can I interrupt for a second?
Sure.
Do you want me to show the pictures of the place
Yeah,
while you're talking?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
If I recognize, if I recognize the building, there are 200 buildings, so I probably won't recognize them all. But if I do, I'll tell you what they are.
And we will have pictures of this facility up on our website as well. Yeah, go ahead, Jerry.
Right, now this is the Powell Building. This was the first original building where the patients were brought that I told you about. And they named it after the first administrator, who was Powell. He created a family-like atmosphere at the institution while he was there, and he wanted it to have this appearance. And they had games. They were able to roam the grounds, and a lot of patients were recovering. It kind of went downhill after Powell left. Right. This is one of the hallways in the Powell Building. It was the very first building. Let's see what we got coming up here next. Now
This says it's the Jones Building.
That's the Jones Building. I'm getting a lot of feedback here. That's a Jones Building. That's one of the original psychiatric buildings. It's one of the hardcore psychiatric buildings where these shock treatments were done. So these are the morgue drawers, and I met the mortician. There was one full-time mortician there, and he was a pretty strange guy. I got him to give me a tour of his morgue once. I got some interesting stories about him, but they don't fit in here. Go ahead and move on. That somebody knocked a hole so you could see the ward. Here's 1883. This thing was built. It was a Georgia lunatic asylum at that time. Down below is a typical ward, what a typical ward looked like. You had those bars in front of the windows so patients couldn't smash the windows and escape.
What is this?
This is the part of the inside of the Jones Building. That was one of the hardcore psychiatric buildings that we saw. Here's the patient graveyard, one of the patient graveyards here, and that's one that looks good. A lot of them were, you just see depressions in the ground. Wow. And little metal tags. So
it looks like Arlington National Cemetery. There's so many of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's
the
just
end of that.
Yeah, that's good enough. That's just a small fraction of a very small fraction of how many were buried there.
Yeah, and just to underscore the point, Jerry worked at a place that has a long history going back to before the American Civil War, and the land around there was psychically and spiritually scarred. General Sherman's troops burnt everything down aside from that so-called lunatics asylum. And you heard accounts Jerry related about the horrific treatment meted out to some of these patients. And then on top of that, there's upwards of 20,000 plus corpses buried there. So we're talking from a spiritual standpoint, a place that's, let's say, less than restful.
Yeah, it was a very strange place. And that's where I started learning about I heard for the first time that the voices, these hallucinations were voices. That was never mentioned in any of the psych courses. It's only that, they're hallucinating and they're out of touch with reality, and that was it. there was nothing more than that. There was no investigation into what the hallucinations were, or, it's like they're hallucinations, blow them off. So, when I found out that these things were voices, I wanted to know what they were saying. Now, psychiatry demanded that they be ignored. Now, the only place they didn't ignore them was if they heard that the voices were telling the patient to kill themselves. Mm-hmm. In that case, it became very real. They reacted like somebody poked with a hot stick. They take those patients, put them on suicide watch, fill them full of drugs. They didn't want them suiciding on their watch. So they went from, these are meaningless hallucinations, to jumping like, a cat on a hot tin roof when they heard that the voices were telling these people to kill themselves. So psychiatry was always at the top of the pecking order, and all of them believed these voices were unreal hallucinations of no consequence. Now, when I went to try to talk to some of these patients about what they were saying, when they found out I was doing that, they ordered me not to. They said they're hallucinations. All you're doing is reinforcing the hallucinations. You're upsetting the patients, and you're making them worse. Now, I did notice that some of them got upset when I started asking questions about their voices, and I wasn't sure why, but they didn't get all that upset. I mean, none of them went ballistic or anything like that. But every time they found out I was asking those questions, they ordered me to stop. So, when I saw that the voices were consistently negative, they ran a consistently negative pattern, I got suspicious, because hallucinations are random. They're all over the place. They're positive, they're negative, they're neutral, they're crazy, they're all over. There is no pattern to them. The voices were consistently, unswervingly negative. And when I saw that, I went, wait a minute, this doesn't fit. And it kind of hooked my curiosity. So I've pretty much defied their order, and kind of kept asking questions about what the voices were, to the best, as far as I could get. Now the psychiatrists were real concerned, like I said, about the voices telling these patients to kill themselves. They would just jump like a cat on a hot tin roof when they heard that. So you look into the suicide rate of schizophrenics who are hearing voices. It's 4 times higher than the normal population. There appeared to be a very clear correlation between these particular hallucinations and the suicide rate of schizophrenics. The suicide rate over the lifetime of a schizophrenic patient ranges from 10 to 22.3%. That's pretty high. 4 in 10 people who suffer from schizophrenia will attempt suicide. The suicide rate for schizophrenics is up to 10 times higher than the regular population. 20 to 40% of schizophrenic males had made at least one suicide attempt. So, and it was very common for the voices to be telling these patients that they were worthless, they were a burden to their families and everybody around them, and to just off themselves and get it over with. The voices were telling them that their families and everybody else would be better off if they were dead. Psychiatry didn't seem to understand what they were going through. It was like, they just hear this stuff and they'd lock them on suicide watch and drug them up. So the patients learned to kind of keep this stuff to themselves. They learned that if they complained too much about their voices, they were going to end up locked up and drugged senseless. So, now that was kind of like the background. Like if they spoke too much about the voices, there was no positive benefit for them to do that. They'd already had a history of, out in the community when they told people about the voices, people thought they were possessed or weird or crazy. Their parents were all freaked out. people avoided them. They became afraid of them. Their parents would drag them into psychiatrists and they would drug them senseless. I mean, there was no positive benefit to these people to talking about these voices. So they kept them to themselves. And I didn't know till later that the voices themselves were telling them not to tell anybody about them. And I found that out several years later. But that kind of freaked me out. Now, while I was working in the state prison, several times while I was questioning inmates about their voices, the voices would come through, and they would tell the inmate, "Don't tell him anything more. He already knows too much. Shut up." That's happened several times, and I'm going, "That's a hallucination. Yeah, that's a damn strange hallucination." So there is no benefit to these patients talking about their voices. So it's hard to get them to talk about it. They have to trust you, and they're paranoids. They don't trust many people. So you have to kind of get past that. So I wanted to know what else these voices were telling them, and ran right into that wall of there is no benefit to them talking about this. There were a lot of trust issues, but the general pattern was negative, and it was consistent. These things, whatever they were, weren't random. So one after another, I found that this explanation that they were hallucinations didn't mesh with what I was seeing, and I wanted to know what those voices were saying, and I wanted to know what psychiatry was thinking about what was causing these things. Virtually all the mental health staff there were programmed to believe that the voices were hallucinations caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain. Right? So psychiatry was saying that, social workers were saying that, counselors were saying, nurses were all, but what didn't make sense was that if it was a chemical imbalance of the brain, why did psychiatry never give any lab tests to find out what the imbalance was and how much the imbalance was? That never happened. How could they know what's out of balance out of all the dozens of neurotransmitters in the brain if they didn't give any lab tests or measure them in any way? That never happened. So I'm like, okay, if it's a chemical imbalance, what are these yokels doing? I mean, there is no measurement to tell what the imbalance is, how much the imbalance is, what is imbalanced, and I'm like, why? So I checked into that, and they have no tests to tell what is out of balance by how much. It seemed to be, this is what they were taught in medical school, this is what they believed it is, but there was no, what were they doing? Now, what I saw them do was a shotgun approach. They would try one antipsychotic drug, and if that didn't work, they would try another, and if that didn't work, they would try another, and they would just go through this wheel of antipsychotic psychotropic drugs until they hit one that worked the best. There was no scientific anything to that. It was trial and error. Oh, well, we got this arsenal of stuff. It was a shotgun approach. Now these were all different meds with totally different chemical compositions, but they all had the same effect of sedating the patient. They were all major tranquilizers. So, here they're saying, oh yeah, there's a correlation between giving these drugs and the psychotic symptoms kind of slacking off. All right, so and they do. They pointed that out. What they completely ignored was that there's also a very strong one-to-one correlation between the sedation of these patients and the lessening of their psychotic symptoms. A much more straight, solid correlation than what they had. And this was being totally ignored. So what I saw was a link between these patients being sedated and the voices ameliorating or dropping down. They never questioned these contradictions. I mean, they just didn't exist for them. And the more I looked into it, they have absolutely no evidence, no solid evidence for chemical imbalance theory. All they have is a correlation, between throwing chemicals at the brain and interfering with the reuptake of some of the neurotransmitters. So, you know, some of the psychiatrists have come out themselves. There's one, Alan Francis, who's a psychiatrist and former member of the DSM task force. He said there are no objective tests in psychiatry, no X-ray laboratory or exam findings that definitively show that someone does or does not have a mental disorder. He says it's bull. I mean, you just can't define it. Okay? And there's another one that came from a paper called Shrink Wraps. Three psychiatrists explained their work. And they come out and they wrote in one of the journals, I guess it was, chemical imbalance is a term with imprecise meaning. Saying that a psychiatric disorder is caused by a chemical imbalance sometimes makes psychiatric disorders more palatable to patients and less stigmatizing. The term gives some credence to the practice of testing these disorders, treating these disorders with medication, but there is no psychiatric disorder for which we know certain chemicals are imbalanced, if any. Now, there was another psychiatrist who came out of the ivory tower, convinced that this was a chemical imbalance, and found that it wasn't, that there was no proof of it. And they said one of the first phrases parents hear when a loved one shows symptoms of a bipolar or psychotic disorder or persistent major depression is chemical imbalance. And this person said, I remember being shocked when I wrote this term in a Washington Post op-ed piece and was confronted by someone who told me there is absolutely no scientific evidence that mental illnesses are caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain. Now, this is a psychiatrist who went through medical school believing this horse garbage and finding out later that there was no evidence for it. And so the ivory tower is programming these people to come out believing this. So they do not know the cause of schizophrenia. They can't attribute it to a chemical imbalance. And we're going to talk about, they have no idea how to cure it. We'll be talking about that in the next interview. Now, in reality, their drugs only temporarily suppress psychotic symptoms with terrible side effects. They don't cure anything. So why do they keep pushing a chemical imbalance? One of the reasons might be ego. It said, here's another publication in February 2002 by Elliot Wallenstein, a PhD, Professor Emeritus of Psychology and Neuroscience. He says, a theory that is wrong is considered preferable to admitting our ignorance.
Very good.
So, here's these insiders that were much higher up in the system than I was, saying the same thing I'm telling you. And then you look at the junk that they publish. I mean, the ivory tower survives by publishing, and they publish junk. Over half the research articles published by psychologists are not repeatable, and they're unreliable. Psychology and psychiatry are not held to anywhere near the same standards that the hard sciences are. And when I was in the doctoral program in psychology, the head of the department got up there and was actually teaching us how to lie with statistics. I couldn't believe my ears. And this guy used to be an ex-reverend.
Wow.
Here's another one, Jeffrey Schauler, Schaler. Now he has a videotape on this, and he said the controversy regarding the myth of mental illness in psychiatry is not about science or medication or medicine. It's about power. When psychiatrists start agreeing with you, well, then perhaps you ought to reconsider your position. Something may be wrong. So I'd like to say a few disobedient things, which are especially true because I was trained as a psychologist, and when a member of the profession criticizes its own, it's considered especially sacrilegious. I can attest to that. What do we know that is true that the cult of psychiatry keeps telling us is false? The first idea is that there is a known brain lesion causing mental illness. The truth is, we cannot tell who is mentally ill and who is not by looking at pictures of their brains or analyzing their blood. There is no blood test. Psychiatrists had to invent their own book of diseases because pathologists would have nothing to do with them. It's called the DSM, a great work of fiction. What's the difference between the DSM and a scientific book of disease? Every disorder in the DSM was invented. Every disease listed in the pathology textbook was discovered. The video of his speech is located on his website, or Sherry's website, under paranormal videos. So back in around 1915, this DSM had about 30 different diagnoses. That was it. And immediately those diagnoses began being abused by the courts. At Central State Hospital in 1915, the director of the hospital found that the courts and local government had committed 105 people found to have no mental illness whatsoever. Now that was before the population reached 13,000. So if you got committed to Central State Hospital during the 1950s when the population was 13,000, you were thrown into a sea of insanity, and with a 1 to 100 patient ratio, you would never be able to prove you weren't sane. You'd be stuck in there for years. So what this did, even back in 1915, it was tangible evidence that any citizen could be diagnosed with an unclassified mental illness, stripped of their rights, and sent to an insane asylum for a long period of time before ever being discovered. And I saw some in there that I didn't think anything was wrong with. So the DSM started out with about a dozen mental illnesses that were made up. And among those were something called Southern Belle Syndrome, which was that was an official psychiatric diagnosis that they had in the DSM at one time. So I imagine after the Southern Belles slapped the crap out of a few of these guys, they took it out of there. Yeah. Homosexuality was another one. It was considered a mental illness. Today, here's a few of the ones they have in there today. Now listen to this. Separation anxiety disorder, social phobia disorder, caffeine-related disorders, elimination disorders, female orgasmic disorder, jet lag disorder, male erectile disorder, mathematics disorder. I have that. They locked me up for that one. Nicotine use disorder, nightmare disorder, reading disorder, over-anxious disorder of childhood, sleep terror disorder, sexual aversion disorder, female sexual arousal disorder. And this goes on and on and on. There's hundreds of these things.
They have a new one, oppositional defiance disorder, which I guess you would be regarded as having because...
Yeah, I'd have that for sure. That's for darn sure. And
it makes you want to ask just who's crazy here,
Well, yeah, especially when you look at them and they tell you, oh, this is a hallucination, and then they find out that the patient hears voices telling them to kill themselves, and all of a sudden it's not a hallucination anymore. What's with that? You talk about schizophrenic behavior. So, one of the most common and most devastating of all these disorders is schizophrenia, and they have totally ignored its most prevalent symptom, which are the voices, which they call hallucinations, and they've dismissed it. They haven't done a single study on what these hallucinations are or how they work. Not one. Yet they insist they're hallucinations, and they insist you not ask questions about them because you're upsetting the patient. All right? So the medications that they dish out cure absolutely nothing. They just merely suppress the symptoms while destroying the patient's central nervous system, or peripheral nervous system, I should say. And these drugs that are given out are known as antipsychotic drugs or neuroleptics or major tranquilizers. Now that's listed, defined as an antipsychotic drug on a class of medication primarily used to manage psychosis, including delusions, hallucinations, paranoia, or disordered thought. So it's interesting. They say these guys have a thought disorder, but they've never studied their thoughts. They never looked at the thoughts. They never asked them about their thoughts. They're hallucinations. So how are you supposed to fix a thought disorder if you don't know what it is or how it works? But no, that's what they do. they said these drugs are increasingly being used in the management of non-psychotic disorders. So now they're spreading them to people who are not psychotic and dumbing them down. Antipsychotics are usually effective in relieving symptoms of psychosis in the short term. All right. So I found out, some of this, when I was there, one of the big drugs they were dishing out was Thorazine. And I have a friend that I didn't know he worked on the same psychiatric eye unit that I did until just a few weeks ago when we were talking about this. And he said when he was dishing out that Thorazine with his bare hands, he would get horrible rashes on his hands and arms, and he had to go and use rubber gloves to pass these meds out. Can you imagine? Yeah. So here they're dishing out these meds, saying, okay, they're correcting temporarily some chemical imbalance of the brain, but imagine what these things are doing to the body. Never was it mentioned, any kind of spiritual anything mentioned anywhere. I mean, they treated these people like broken cars. So for decades, when you look back on the history of these drugs, no one knew how they worked when they came out in the 50s. They knew they worked. They didn't know how they worked. They didn't know why they worked. And that went on for almost 20 years where they didn't know why they worked. Then after about 20 years, the ivory tower started saying, oh, well, there's a correlation between these drugs, which are chemicals, and a chemical imbalance, so they must be fixing some kind of chemical imbalance of the brain. So they started publishing that these things were correcting a chemical imbalance in the brain. Then the drug companies jumped in there and said, oh, yeah, that's what they're doing. So based on a correlation between the alteration of dopamine and serotonin levels in the brain, which yield a temporary suppression of psychotic symptoms, they kept pushing this correlation, saying it was a chemical imbalance of the brain. But even in freshman statistics classes, everyone teaches that a correlation does not constitute causation, and that's all they had. The black magicians in the ivory tower and big pharma only had a correlation. They had no substantial evidence whatsoever, none. And they kept putting out all these bogus publications as if the chemical imbalance was a fact. So the patients were told by psychiatrists that there is no cure. And in fact, 80% of schizophrenics who quit taking their antipsychotic drugs will regress within 2 years. And the patients were told that the only treatment there were these expensive antipsychotic drugs, and that they had to stay on them for their entire life. Now, what the patients weren't told was that these antipsychotic drugs were rotting out their peripheral nervous systems and causing something called Extrapyramidal Syndrome, which resulted in a constant shaking, an uncontrollable shaking. So where patients at the hospital were told that they had to stay on these antipsychotic drugs for the rest of their lives. And what would happen was they would eventually develop something called Extrapyramidal Syndrome, where their peripheral nervous system was actually being rotted out and destroyed by these drugs. Now, that caused an uncontrollable quiver or shaking. So they'd walk around, they're just shaking, kind of like an alcoholic going through detox. I mean, they just couldn't stop this shaking. Now, if they didn't back off those antipsychotic drugs then, it would cause permanent damage to their nervous system. So what they did was come up with another amazing way to deal with this, and they gave them something called cogentin, which suppressed this shaking, but it didn't stop the ongoing damage when they continued with the antipsychotic drugs. So what that eventually ended up in is destroying their nervous system, and chronic patients who'd been taking this stuff for years would develop what everyone around the hospital knew as the Thorazine shuffle. So they had this weird, odd shuffle. They don't know what causes schizophrenia, period, and they don't know how to cure it, as Sherry and I have both done. Right? We're going to go into the specifics of that later. So I'm going to turn this over to Sherry for a few minutes here to let her talk about how big a problem it is and why there's so little research about it.
Yeah, this is actually a devastating disorder, and it's destroying about 2.5 million Americans, the lives of 2.5 million Americans, and about 24 million people around the globe. Despite these epidemic proportions, there's hardly any research that I could find. I mean, I looked all over and I couldn't find where there's actually any research being done about what this is, how to help people. The only thing I have seen is the continuous chemical imbalance thing and more drugs. And so the question is, why is there so little research and into the cause of schizophrenia? And I don't know what the answer is to that for sure, but I think some may be fear of the unknown. And like Jerry said earlier, it's an ego issue for the psychiatrists. I don't really know. So, maybe they believe there's no more to learn because they think they have all the answers. It's hard to say. So maybe these people are just not important to them. Jerry's said many times that, they're considered just crazies. This is just what they do. So why do they keep pushing the myth as to the cause? I think Jerry has the answer to that, and he'll speak to that in a minute. To just follow the money, and he'll just explain that. And why is the research funding to find a cure so tiny, so minuscule compared to the funding of other research of mental disorders? There's more money spent on other kinds of what they call mental disorders, but not schizophrenia. I just think they want to turn their head on that. So turn it back over to you, Jerry.
Yeah, the actual research monies going into schizophrenia is minuscule compared to virtually every other kind of disorder. Schizophrenia is one of the top 10 world health problems, top 10 in the entire world, and they're spending nothing on it. So you look at it and you go, well, either they don't know what causes it. It looks like they don't care about finding what causes it based on how little money they're spending looking for an answer. And then if you take a look at and follow the money, all right, here's an article in the New York Times that was on the front page. It said recently, a front page splash about psychiatry's propensity to prescribe pills, and it says, talk doesn't pay. So psychiatry turns instead to drug therapy. Now, what Sherry and I are going to be talking about in the next interview is how to cure this with talk, without drugs, without locking these people up, by understanding what causes it and how to go after it. Mm-hmm. So it says, that news is already widely known in the mental health field as far as turning to drug therapy, but it has vast ramifications for Americans trying to maintain their sanity in our market-driven medical system and for delivering mental health care. It says mental health or mental illness has not decreased with a change from talk therapy to drugs. In fact, Robert Whitaker's book on diagnoses and mental illnesses in America has become an established, it says it's become an established epidemic. So-called miracle drugs like Prozac are taken by 11% of the population. Prozac is only one of 30 available antidepressants on the market. Antidepressants are accompanied by anti-anxiety and antipsychotic drugs. Xanax, America's leading anti-anxiety medication, is so ubiquitous that Xanax generates more revenue than Tide detergent, reports, says Charles Barber. I don't know exactly who he was, but I believe it. It says antipsychotic drugs alone net the pharmaceutical industry at least $14.6 billion a year. Billion. Psychopharmaceuticals are the most profitable sector of the industry, which makes it one of the most profitable businesses in the world. Americans are less than 5% of the world's population, yet they consume 66% of the world's psychological medications. 66% of the world's medications.
Join the party. Jeez.
You talk about dumbing down the population. You know, my heavens. You know, it says, do these psychopharmaceuticals work to restore mental health? Actually, the evidence is overwhelming that they fail. Antidepressants, the most popular psychopharmaceuticals, work no better than placebos. They work 25% of the time and stop working when the user stops taking them. In addition, they may actually harm patients in the long run. They disrupt brain neurotransmitters and may usurp the brain's organic soothing functions. The long-term use of antipsychotics is associated with side effects such as involuntary movement disorder, which is EPS I just talked to you about, gynecomastia, I don't even know what that is, metabolic syndrome, and associated with increased mortality in elderly people with dementia. So it's clear that selling these drugs or drug like these antipsychotics to cure absolutely nothing, but if they're not taken, the person goes psychotic, right? So they have them over a barrel. You know, it cures nothing. They charge a fortune for it, but if they don't take it, they go psychotic, all right? Or they get thrown in prison. You know, I got the sun going down on me now, so I may have some light reflecting on me here.
Oh, it looks fine.
All right. So, you know, one of the things I noticed when I got into Central State was, you know, we had this big lunchroom where all the staff met together, and all the scuttlebutt from all over the hospital, the grapevine, came out of that kitchen. And there were constant reports of psychiatrists, not psychologists, but psychiatrists, that were being attacked by patients constantly. And I noticed they were being attacked at a higher rate than attendants that spent 24 hours a day with them, or nurses that spent twice as much time as psychiatrists with them, or any other staff except maybe attendants, you know. So I went and looked into that. And, you know, they were in fact being attacked at a much higher rate. So I'll talk about that a little bit later. But let's see, where am I here?
I just want to make a point also that the prognosis, right, is open-ended. You'll just have to take these psych drugs till the day you die. There's no light at the end of the tunnel. There's no happy ending. It's just you're going to be on these forever. And meanwhile, their cognitive function is being destroyed. Their nervous system is being destroyed. Oh, but they've got, you know, another drug to, you know, subdue the shakes that are wrought by these psych drugs. And also the fact that increasingly, and you touched on this, Jerry, that psychology is being used as a weapon of state. And like the old Soviet Union used to, oh, you don't believe in this workers' paradise we live in, you know, Tovarich, and then they throw him into a prison and they shoot him up full of drugs. And that's already starting to happen in our Western society. Sherry talked about a case recently in the UK where a woman, you know, doing proper investigative work like people should be doing, she was thrown into a loony bin and shot up full of drugs. And definitely we'll put that article up on our website. So, and also the fact that CIA psychiatrists are being utilized in these black rendition sites where they're giving advice on how best to torture these detainees, so-called. So what we're seeing is a complete inversion. Instead of helping these people, these phony diagnoses are being made up, and they're being plied with all these drugs, which make a mammoth profit for the drug companies. Nobody gets any better. And it also goes back to the fact that this word schizophrenia, Sherry, I'd like your thoughts on this as well. It's almost like a slur. It's like a derogatory term that's like a catch-all phrase nowadays. It's almost used like, oh, you're a schizoid. You know, what you're saying doesn't make any sense. You're schizophrenic. Did you want to comment on that for a second, Sherry?
Yeah, well, yeah, schizophrenia is it's a label as far as I'm concerned. I mean, well, it is a label. And if anybody is thinking out of the robot norm, then they could be labeled schizophrenic. Like if they hear voices, or if they have strange thoughts that pop into their head, or if they see angels, or any number of out-of-body experiences, anything out of the ordinary. If it can't be explained and you can't measure it and nobody knows what you're talking about because they haven't experienced it, you could be labeled schizophrenic. Well, if you're labeled schizophrenic, that can ruin a person's life because of the way society's been taught to think of what that is. They don't know. I mean, they really can't be blamed. They've just not been educated in what it is. So yeah, I mean, and the drug problem, the drugging problem, that case in UK is not the only one, and it's not just starting. It's been going on quite a long time.
That's right.
It's being used to curtail free speech. They've used it on whistleblowers a lot.
Oh yeah.
And I can't think of the cases off the top of my head, but I can get that for you if you like. But yeah, this has been going on for a very long time. So yeah, schizophrenia, you bring up a good point, because it is one of those funny words. It's kind of, you have to say it a few times before you can get used to saying it. It's kind of almost a tongue twister. It's schizophrenia, whatever. Yeah, it's not, it's just used as a weapon. There's no, people have some mental problems. I understand that. And we're not saying that nobody has, the mental problems don't exist, but the majority of things that happen to a person that cause them to go psychotic, they're not organic defects in the brain. They're caused by a number of things, and the root is probably, if they've been abused, or if they've been raped, or if they've been had a very, very abusive childhood, or they take certain drugs, and Jerry will get into that later, that opens them up wide open to be vulnerable to these voices that we're talking about. And they automatically will be labeled schizophrenia. That's why I never did go to see anybody for help. I already knew this stuff. I don't know how I knew it, but I did. I knew that if I was having thoughts that didn't belong to me, and I said I was having thoughts that didn't belong to me, there was no way that I could go to anybody and tell them, hey, look, I don't know what these are, but they're not mine. I would have been called schizophrenic, and I would have been hauled off to, an institution and drugged silly.
Yep, I can guarantee you that's what would have happened. I've seen a number of patients tell psychiatrists these voices are real. They're not hallucinations, they're real. And the psychiatrists come back on them with all the power of their degree and say, oh no, you're hallucinating, they're not real, they're hallucinations, and we have to drug you to kind of keep them under control. And patients would kind of back off. They wouldn't tell psychiatrists when they were hearing these things because they didn't want to be drugged further.
I don't blame them.
I don't either. So bottom line, there is no incentive for the pharmaceutical industry or psychiatry to find a cure for this stuff. So if you look what happens if you have a psych crisis, and I worked psych crisis for 10 years in the ERs, if somebody loses it, you have to go to a doctor or psychiatrist first to get access to medications. Now that's if you can get into one. So in the meantime, somebody goes psychotic on you, you have to get him in there. Right? Then you pay an exorbitant cost for an office visit, especially if you don't have insurance, or you take them to the emergency room where you get charged again if you have any kind of money, and then they will be sent to a psychiatric hospital, where you will be paying hundreds, if not thousands of dollars for maybe a week's treatment, because once their insurance runs out, the psych hospitals throw them out because they're not making money anymore. So they drug them up, They get the symptoms under control, and they say, okay, go to your local mental health center, which are totally understaffed, underfunded, and overwhelmed. Right? It's this giant merry-go-round.
It's a vicious circle. Now, I think it's a good time to take a break here. What we'll do is, we'll talk more about these issues and definitely getting into the healing aspect of it too, which the pharmaceutical industry and the whole psychiatry industry are loath to hear about. But we'll get all into that. And before we do, Sherry, do you want to mention what the name of your website is?
Yes, it's keyholejourney.com. And you can just Google keyholejourney.com and it'll come up. And can I take a minute to show what it looks like?
Absolutely.
Let's see if I can do this now with the screen sharing again. Hold on. Let's see. Okay. So are you seeing the keyholejourney.com? Yeah. Okay. So this is the website, and the home page is like this. But if anybody comes here, they can go to the topics section, and that's where they'll find a tremendous amount of topics that we've posted up here. But Jerry's 2 pages are paranormal and videos, and I've got another link here for the videos. So here's all of Jerry's articles, and you can find him on Facebook here, and you can go to his YouTube here. And then I've got a couple other scientists are working with Jerry, or trying to work with Jerry, so we can find some scientific evidence to prove what we're saying, so that the scientists will actually have something to grab onto. And I think there are ways to do this, but we can talk about that later. So then all of what Jerry is saying today, there's a page here to some of the research that we found that backs up what he's saying. And so I've got this on a page here, and this is pretty cool. I put this up at the top, and I'm just going to blow it up for a minute, and maybe James, you can read it.
We never produce anything misguided or wicked out of ourselves. It is the evil spirits with us who produce it, and at the same time cause us to believe that it comes from us. Emanuel Swedenborg, Arcana Celestia 761. That's a profound statement, and it's a good point to leave to end this first half. Go ahead and unshare that screen, please.
Okay, gotcha.
You've reached the end of the first segment of the Cosmic Switchboard show. You've been listening to our very special guests, Jerry Marzinsky and Sherry Swiney. Wherever you may be, please go to our website, thecosmicswitchboard.com, sign up and become a member, and we'll see you at the top of the next hour.